kids love that kind of story. All this stuff. I'm so like, I love all these critters. I love critters.
Now, just one of these species, humans, is putting the clock back. We're extinguishing life at the rate of several species a day. In 10 years, it will be several an hour. The grim prospect is that we will no longer have these forests to visit. They won't be there. The remnants of the natural world may, in the end, be confined to places like the Bronx Zoo.
Which is awesome, by the way. If you get a chance, you should really go. Spectacular zoo. Small, but a lot of investment in conservation.
This is the Sultanate of Oman, and these are Arabian oryx, an animal that has ranged across the vast interior deserts of the Arabian Peninsula for perhaps 10,000 years. But these particular animals have been here for less than 10 years. And this is how they got here, by plane. The last wild oryx was shot in 1972. So now, the new arrivals are, in fact, the only Arabian oryx in Arabia. Since 1982, 21 animals have been flown in crates like this, as part of an elaborate program to reintroduce oryx to the wild. Almost all have made a 60-hour trip from the San Diego Wild Animal Park to end up here at the Ulumi Study Center. The manager of the project is Tim Tier.
It's a long journey for them, and they're spending the full time in the boxes. And so it's important when they get to Ulumi that we can move them quickly through, get them into the enclosure, and get them there quickly with the animals that they've arrived with, so that they can settle down as soon as possible. This depends totally on each individual animal, and you can never tell exactly what is going to happen when you're releasing the animals.
The oryx are all descendants of just 9 examples that had, by luck, been preserved in captivity. It's lucky, too, that oryx are even tempered, so they easily get over the disruption unavoidable in a project like this.
As soon as they're let out of the boxes, there's the occasional animal that does get into trouble against the fence, but they learn very quickly, and in general, they settle down well, and that's happened with this recent release. Within 15 minutes after the animals were out of the boxes, they were already feeding on food and drinking water, which meant that that's a fairly quick period of time after 2.5 days in an airplane to be settling down.
The animals enter a 250-acre enclosure where it's hoped a herd structure will develop. If they do establish natural social relationships, the next hurdle will be coexistence with the desert's other inhabitants, particularly the Harassis Bedouin, who are scattered throughout the area. It was not the Harassis who exterminated the wild oryx. Modern trophy hunters did that. But they did traditionally take some animals for meat in hives. Now they would very much like to see the oryx back in the desert, so their help has been enlisted in the reintroduction program. The Harassis are desert experts. They are unequaled in their ability to track and observe the oryx over large areas. Reintroduction programs fail for many reasons, because the original habitat no longer exists, but here it does, or because wild animals compete with local people, and here they don't. Often, the animal's social life is not understood, but as the Bedouin trackers have been able to confirm, the oryx biologists were right. Their educated guesses succeeded in assembling the right mix of males and females of the right ages needed for a functioning herd. The animals in the large desert enclosure are kept under constant observation. The Bedouin rangers report back to the study center, where detailed records of movements and behavior are compiled. After the oryx spent 2 years in the enclosure, the biologists were confident that from 21 animals, 2 viable herds had formed. These have now been released. They are on their own in the desert. But not quite alone. The oryx are still vulnerable to disease or to poachers. So even though the 2 herds are now breeding successfully, they are still watched over as they range over more than 2,000 square miles of desert. The oryx program has everything in its favor: undisturbed habitat, a suitable animal, good science, and enthusiastic local people. But there are at least 2,000 other species for which these ideal conditions do not exist. That number will grow rapidly unless the world's wild places can provide the right conditions for wild species to survive without resort to extraordinary measures like the oryx program. Where once human beings coexisted with nature, now we've come to master it and to destroy it. For biologists like Dan Jansen, this raises the greatest challenge of the age.
We've basically won the battle. We've beaten nature in many, many ways. Now the question is, now that you've beaten nature, you've conquered the planet, are you ready to take all the other species that were there, who were your enemies, and burn them up in an incinerator?
That's exactly what we're doing in the tropical forests. 1 acre burns every second. Such an acre may hold a greater variety of plants and animals than whole countries in Europe or North America. Botanist Peter Raven.
If we look at plants or vertebrates, we see that the rates of extinction that are going on right now during our lifetimes are probably 10,000 times or more quicker than would be normal. In other words, we're living in the middle of the greatest extinction event of the last 65 million years.
At the Missouri Botanical Garden, there are 200,000 different wild plants in the collection. They represent only a tiny fraction of the great natural diversity available to us.
It's just a really strange looking one.
And then Robin's got him all excited.
As Peter Raven, the director here, points out, nature's importance to us is not abstract. It's real.
One of the easy ways to explain the economic value of biological diversity is by talking about plants. We only use a few hundred of them very widely, but 3 of those very familiar ones, wheat, rice, and corn, or maize, provide about 2/3 of all our calories that all human beings all over the world need. But most kinds of plants have never even been looked at to see if they'd be any good or not. These were all derived from wild relatives in the not-so-distant past. And when you look at the kind of diversity that there is of corn, all of this was purchased in a single marketplace in Bolivia. Then you get an idea of the enormous gene pool that people can draw from in developing these crops. Another way that plants are used is as medicines. This one, for example, is a plant that quinine, that important anti-malarial drug, is from. And this one is one of the sources of curare, which is used in modern surgery all over the world as a muscle relaxant. There are thousands and thousands of additional ways that plants might be used if we could just learn about them.
Peter Raven, like many scientists, is appalled at the way we are squandering these natural resources without even exploring them. And biological wealth may be the most basic of all, according to biologist E.O. Wilson.
Every country has 3 kinds of wealth: material, cultural, and biological. We know a great deal about our material and cultural wealth. It's part of the fabric of our everyday lives. We think about it constantly, but we don't pay much attention to biological wealth. But it's extremely important. It sustains us. It's where we came from. And every species has a potentially great value for human beings.
The canopy of the tropical rainforest may be the richest biological storehouse of any place on Earth. Yet, just as we are destroying the planet's biological wealth, we are beginning to learn how astonishingly rich it really is. Here in Peru, biologist Terry Irwin has developed a convenient method for counting insects. After he fogs the forest canopy with a biodegradable insecticide, the insects simply fall into funnels spread out below. What Irwin is finding is astounding biology. He's forced a re-examination of our ideas on the richness of life and on the numbers of species we're extinguishing as we cut down tropical forests. Irwin's insect collections are held here at the Smithsonian in Washington. Less than 20 years ago, it was thought that there were altogether about 3 million species of plants and animals on Earth. The rainforest work has upped the estimate by a factor of 10 to about 30 million. And it's a figure Terry Irwin thinks may still be too low.
My estimate of the early 1980s of 30 million species or more is kind of going by the wayside. In our recent samples from Peru, for example, it looks like perhaps my estimates were a little bit too conservative. Here we have some bottles of insects that I've collected out of the chop of a single tree in Peru. This single tree could have as many as 10,000 species. And the tree next to it, another 10,000, many of which will be different.
Since we had no idea that this tremendous diversity existed, many scientists are now seriously concerned by how poorly we understand the world's complex biological systems.
Biological diversity has to be treated a good deal more seriously as a global resource to be indexed and used and, above all, preserved until we find out what's out there. And
this guy whose voice sounds, do we all agree, kind of wacky, is arguably the greatest living biologist, E.O. Wilson. Right up there with like Charles Darwin and Lamarck and Mendel. I've heard him speak a few times, and the last time he spoke at UCSB, tickets sold out in like 17 minutes, and it was like standing room only, and people were like holding up video cameras to watch him speak, and he just mumbles like he's really old. You can see how old he was in the 80s. By now, he's like 250 years old or something. But everything he says is like gospel. Like, he speaks like the most profound and deep and important truths in biology. He's such an unbelievable idol of the sciences. His like full title is E.O. Wilson, director of the Harvard Museum of Systematics, and his like official teaching position is he is the current person to hold the E.O. Wilson endowed chair at Harvard. So like his job is just to like be him. They pay him for like just, he's like sponsored by Harvard. In science terms, he's sponsored by Harvard. How is that? Yeah.
when it's realized that the little things run the world, we'll understand that the insects and the invertebrates and other small creatures are even more important in the maintenance of our ecosystems than are the higher animals. These little creatures rule the earth by virtue of body weight. We estimate that around the world, ants alone make up more than 1/10 of the animal tissue on the land. That's why it's hard to go anywhere in the world without stepping on an ant.
Along with other little creatures, ants process vegetation, returning nutrients to the soil to keep the forests alive.
How many times have I told you that very same fact? The whole like nutrient cycling and the little stuff and the magic mojo and the keeping plants alive. You never hear about like save the endangered ant or save the endangered moth or worm or whatever. Nobody cares about the little stuff. Everybody wants to save the whales and the pandas as if they mattered. But the funny thing is that they're not. And I mean, like, it's a reasonable question, and I get your point. I know, right? Like, they're everywhere. Well, there's an invasive ant everywhere. It's Argentinian, like me. The ant you see everywhere that's doing really well is an invasive ant that apparently